Hi everybody, today we are going to go over a few examples of cell transport, and we're not going to quite go over all of these examples listed today, but we are going to go over a few of them. So let's begin. So first of all, let's think about osmolarity. Do you see this term here, osmolarity? And you may be thinking, all right, what does this mean? So right there, osmolarity. So osmolarity just refers to osmosis. So as we know, there's hypotonic solutions where water goes in. There's isotonic solutions where water goes in and out equally. And then there's hypertonic solutions where most of the water leaves. And this plays a big role on how animals and plants can exist, right? So in terms of an animal cells prefer to be in isotonic environments. So what happens to an animal cell in a hypertonic environment or a hypotonic environment? Well, we know that in a hypotonic environment, the cell may lyse. This is a bad thing. And in a hypertonic environment, the cell may shrivel. So we really don't like to be in an environment that's too salty or that's too pure in terms of water. We like something that's about equal to our cells. So what does this mean? Well, it means that our body needs to keep our cells and the liquid outside of our cells at a constant molarity. The same amount of sugar, the same amount of salt. We don't want that varying too much. So this term here, homeostasis, an important term for all of biology. Remember this term. This is the steady equilibrium of internal conditions in the cells. It's the idea that your cells like to be at the same level all the time. So how can we make sure our cells never become hypertonic or hypotonic to their environment? Well, one of the ways that we do this is we use kidneys. So kidneys are an adaptation many animals have that assist in maintaining, there's that term again, homeostasis in the blood. So the kidneys help filter solute out of the blood, and they help keep our cells at that constant level. If you get too much sodium, if you don't have enough sodium, it helps to keep those levels constant. So that's one adaptation, your kidneys. What about a plant? Well, we know that plants have a cell wall that prevents the cell from bursting, and they have a central vacuole that helps to store water. So that's really going to be the plant cell's main adaptation, is that plant cells like to be in a hypotonic environment, but they can only do that because of that cell wall that prevents them from bursting. So that's a plant cell adaptation. And then there are other examples. So there is a single-celled eukaryote called the paramecium, and these are animal-like, but there's one big difference. They only have one cell, and they live in fresh water. So if they are single-celled and they live in fresh water, well, fresh water is hypotonic, isn't it? So that means that water keeps coming in to the paramecium. So doesn't this mean the paramecium is going to burst, it's going to pop, it's going to explode? Well, it doesn't. And why not? Well, it has to do with these special organs down here. These special organs prevent the paramecium from lysing or breaking. So this is called a contractile vacuole. And what a contractile vacuole does is, let's see, let me click this link. So the contractile vacuole will help to pump water out. So here we see a video, and notice what's going on there. It's This one's going to go next. It's closing. What it's doing is it's filled with water, and now it's going to squeeze the water out. So you see this one happening down here, squeezing the water out. This one is squeezing as well, a little bit, not quite working as well. So the paramecium, they fill with water, and that contractile vacuole squeezes the water out. So that is what they do. Okay. So that is the paramecium. Now as we go back, our last example is going to be of simple diffusion. So simple diffusion, what does diffusion look like inside of the human body? This is going to be our big example, and our example is going to be the respiratory system. So a few things to keep in mind. Number one, that oxygen goes into our blood. So we want our blood to have oxygen. And the other thing to keep in mind is that carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood. So we want to get rid of carbon dioxide. We want that oxygen, and we want to get rid of CO2 that builds up. So that is the key. So our respiratory system operates through diffusion. Now think about what you know about oxygen and carbon dioxide. These two gases, how can they get through a membrane? Is it simple diffusion or is it facilitated diffusion? You may remember that because both of these things are nonpolar, it's simple diffusion. So here is our circulatory system. So our circulatory system should bring oxygen to our cells and carry CO2 away from our cells. And we see that happening here. We have a red blood cell. This red blood cell has oxygen and is flowing through our blood vessel. And when it gets to our body, about the middle of the blood vessel, the oxygen is going to diffuse across that membrane out. Meanwhile, our body cells have made a lot of CO2, and that CO2, it's got to go. So the CO2 diffuses into our blood, and the blood vessel carries the CO2 away. Right? And then we have our respiratory system. Our respiratory system is where gas exchange happens. This is where we get oxygen from the air, and this is where we exhale CO2 out into the air. So these two things work closely together to maintain homeostasis of CO2 and O2. So our circulatory and respiratory systems meet in the lungs in a specific area called the alveoli. So the alveoli is like the ends, the bulk of our lungs. So you can see them in this picture. They're microscopic, tiny little air sacs, and we have millions of them. There's lots of them. And you notice that they are covered in these tiny, tiny blood vessels called capillaries. You may have heard of capillaries before. Very thin, very narrow blood vessels. So this is where the blood vessels meet the lung. So what happens is that in the lung, we've got a lot of oxygen, and we want to get that to the body. And in our blood vessels and our capillaries, the capillaries have come and they have picked up a bunch of CO2. So what's going on? Well, if we look at the picture on the bottom right, blood is entering from the left where I'm drawing this arrow. And this blood is coming from the body where it has picked up a lot of carbon dioxide. So we have a high carbon dioxide level in the blood. And because it goes from high to low, diffusion pushes the CO2 out. So diffusion causes the CO2 to move from the blood to the lung. All right, so we've gotten rid of the CO2. Now let's think about what's going on inside of the lung. If you've just inhaled, you have a high level of oxygen. And if you have a high level of oxygen in your blood, what is diffusion going to do? Diffusion is going to cause that high level, and it's going to cause the oxygen to move to an area of lower concentration, and that would be in your blood. So the O2 is moving from your lungs into your blood. And this is how diffusion causes you to pick up O2 and drop off CO2. So the blood entering the capillaries again, this blood entering the capillaries has lots of carbon dioxide, but not much oxygen. So the carbon dioxide diffuses out. The air in your lungs and your alveoli has a lot of oxygen. So that oxygen diffuses into your blood, and your blood then carries that to the rest of your body, like perhaps your brain or your liver or your muscles. And that is how gas exchange occurs in your lungs. All right, and we see another picture of it here. Let's just ignore everything on that side and let's just pay attention to the left. Again, CO2, high to low, diffuses into your lungs. Oxygen going from high to low does the opposite, diffuses into your blood. So it can be carried to the rest of the parts of your body. All right, and that is where we are going to end for today. So if you have any questions, make sure you let me know.